Hello there. Welcome back to Storytime with Skoke. My name is Mike, also known to listeners and viewers of the podcast as Skoke, and I'm quite pleased to return and be with you once again for another spooky short story reading. Thanks for joining me. It's good to see you. Tonight's we got a double header here. We got a couple of them. Lost Hearts by M.R. James and Dagon by H.P. Lovecraft coming right up in just a moment. But first, I want to just quickly mention last time I was in a Goldblum kind of a mood, listening to some of his music, and mentioned that I met him. I met Jeff Goldblum at one of his concerts here in Chicago. So I have footage of the encounter, and I would like to show you that right now. Let's take a look at the clip.
I think we got some.
Hello, Jeff.
Thank you. Hello.
Pleasure to see you.
It's my pleasure entirely.
There it was. It's on my. I was just saying. It's a little different. I can't share the videos I play here with Instagram Live. So I was just explaining during the video that that Jeff Goldblum encounter video is on my social media. It's on my Instagram there. So you can find the weird, wonderful moment of Jeff Goldblum and me having an encounter. Also, I wanted to mention Mic'd Up at the Movies, the best bits, the video series in which I show you the best parts of spooky films. I've released a new episode since we last gathered, and it features White Zombie, the early 30s Universal picture. And I would like to play it for you right now. So let's take a look at White Zombie. Hello there. Welcome to Mic'd Up at the Movies, the best bits. My name is Mike, I'm your host, and I'm here to show you the best parts of spooky films. We'll take a look now at White Zombie. No, not that White Zombie. I'm talking about the 1932 Universal picture. Now, once in a while, an actor's performance in a film is so stunning, they completely outshine everyone else in the movie. In White Zombie, there is one such actor. This is Bela Lugosi, celebrated for his roles in Dracula, The Raven, Son of Frankenstein, a legend of the horror genre. But I'm not talking about him. I'm talking about this guy. Well, that'll do it for this episode of Mic'd Up at the Movies, the best bits. We'll see you next time. All right. Okay. You're not even a vulture. You're an ostrich. They didn't have any vultures. That was Mic'd Up at the Movies, the best bits, featuring White Zombie. You can see all previous episodes of Mic'd Up at the Movies, the best bits, on my YouTube channel. That's Mic'd Up. Also on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook. I'm on all of those platforms, so feel free to have a look around. And a quick mention, the Oh Yeah Comics YouTube channel is where you can find a playlist of all my previous Storytime with Skoke installments. So if you ever want to go back and have another go or catch up on an episode you might not have seen, it's a good place to go. I see, looking at the comments here. Yeah, feel free to drop comments as the reading goes on. Um, I will be reading. I'll be focused on the screen, but I will be able to see your comments, and I'll check in between the two stories we're going to do tonight, and see what's going on. I see Daryl is here. Daryl is, I believe he's enjoying the White Zombie episode. He says, best mic'd up episode yet. Dying. I had a good time with that one. That was fun. I had a co-star there, my ostrich co-star. He enjoyed himself too. It was a tricky one. Did all the puppeteering I did myself. Yes, it's a skill. Hey, Muppet Workshop. I'm ready for you. All right. Hey, one more thing before we get to our tale. I want to quickly flip through the reading catalog that I been talking about here and there over time as we've had our readings. Just a quick review. Feels like a book club. Dead Man Tells the Spooky Tales by Franco is available now. 'Tis the season for spooky things. This is a great all ages spooky book. Check that out. Wrapped Up by my podcast mate, good pal Scoop McMahon, and Dave Scheit. Dave Scheit is the writer. Saw him on the train last night. Hello, Dave Scheit. Wrapped Up the series. They got a couple graphic novels out now. Saved by the Belle Reve by Art and Franco. There's a Tiny Titans story in this anthology, so if you're a fan of the Titans, check that out. And we have The Lonely Vampire by Franco and Patrick Scullin. Poor guy just needs a friend. Hope he finds one. Speaking of vampires, Dracula, the graphic novel, an excellent adaptation of the story, putting Bela Lugosi in that tale. It's quite a bit different from the movie. So that's another one to take a look at. And finally, Patrick the Wolf Boy. This is an early work from Art and Franco, one of their earlier collaborations. And this is the first issue. There are more issues and volumes out there. I don't know where exactly they're available or whether or not they're currently in print, but they are floating around out there. So those are some Halloween spooky themed writings for your reading pleasure. Now, let us begin. Let's begin our tales. Thank you all once again for joining me. Apologies, Instagram Live. I appear to be having some issues with my connection. So I may be cutting in and out during this, but you can always slide on over to the Oh Yeah Comics YouTube channel or on Facebook. I'm live over there now too. A quick warning as well. These are spooky tales, perhaps not for kids. And if you don't like scary things, you might not like this either. So fair warning. And let's get into the spooky things. Lost Hearts by M.R. James. It was, as far as I can ascertain, in September of the year 1811 that a postchaise drew up before the door of Aswarby Hall in the heart of Lincolnshire. The little boy who jumped out as soon as it had stopped looked about him with the keenest curiosity during the short interval that elapsed between the ringing of the bell and the opening of the door. He saw a tall, square, red brick house built in the reign of Anne. A stone pillared porch had been added in the purest classical style of 1790. The windows of the house were many, tall and narrow, with small panes and thick white woodwork. A pediment, pierced with a round window, crowned the front. There were wings to the right and left, connected by curious glazed galleries, supported by colonnades, with the central block. These wings plainly contained the stables and offices of the house. Each was surmounted by an ornamental cupola with a gilded vane. An evening light shone on the building, making the window panes glow like so many fires. Away from the hall in front stretched a flat park, studded with oaks and fringed with firs, which stood out against the sky. The clock in the church tower, buried in trees on the edge of the park, only its golden weathercock, catching the light, was striking 6, and the sound came, gently beating down the wind. It was altogether a pleasant impression, though tinged with the sort of melancholy appropriate to an evening in early autumn, that was conveyed to the mind of the boy who was standing in the porch, waiting for the door to open to him. The postchaise had brought him from Warwickshire, or Warwickshire, depending on where you're from, where, some 6 months before, he had been left an orphan. Now, owing to the generous offer of his elderly cousin, Mr. Abney, he had come to live at Aswarby. The offer was unexpected, because all who knew anything of Mr. Abney looked upon him as a somewhat austere recluse, into whose steady-going household the advent of a small boy would import a new and, it seemed, incongruous element. The truth is that very little was known of Mr. Abney's pursuits or temper. The professor of Greek at Cambridge had been heard to say that no one knew more of the religious beliefs of the later pagans than did the owner of Aswarby. Certainly, his library contained all the then available books bearing on the mysteries, the Orphic poems, the worship of Mithras, and the Neoplatonists. In the marble-paved hall stood a fine statue of Mithras slaying a bull, which had been imported from the Levant at great expense by the owner. He had contributed a description of it to the Gentleman's Magazine, and he'd written a remarkable series of articles in the Critical Museum on the superstitions of the Romans of the Lower Empire. He was looked upon, in fine, as a man wrapped up in his books, and it was a matter of great surprise among his neighbors that he should even have heard of his cousin, Stephen Elliott, much more that he should have volunteered to make him an inmate of Aswarby Hall. Whatever may have been expected by his neighbors, it is certain that Mr. Abney, the tall, the thin, the austere, seemed inclined to give his young cousin a kindly reception. The moment the front door was open, he darted out of his study, rubbing his hands with delight. "How are you, my boy? How are you? How old are you?" said he. "That is, you're not too much tired, I hope, by your journey, to eat your supper?" No, thank you, sir," said Master Elliot. "I'm pretty well." "Ah, that's a good lad," said Mr. Abney. "And how old are you, my boy?" It seemed a little odd that he should have asked the question twice in the first 2 minutes of their acquaintance. "I'm 12 years old next birthday, sir," said Stephen. And when is your birthday, my dear boy? 11th of September. Oh, that's well. That's very well. Nearly a year hence, isn't it? I like I like to get these things down in my book. You're sure it's 12 now? You're certain? Yes, quite sure, sir. Well. Take him to Mrs. Bunch's room, Parks, and let him have his tea, supper, whatever it is. Yes, sir, answered the staid Mr. Parks, and conducted Stephen to the lower regions. Mrs. Bunch was the most comfortable and human person whom Stephen had yet as met in Aswarby. She made him completely at home. They were great friends in a quarter of an hour, and great friends they remained. Mrs. Bunch had been born in the neighborhood some 55 years before the date of Stephen's arrival, and her residence at the Hall was of 20 years standing. Consequently, if anyone knew the ins and outs of the house and the district, Mrs. Bunch knew them, and she was by no means disinclined to communicate her information. Certainly, there were plenty of things about the Hall and the Hall gardens which Stephen, who was of an adventurous and inquiring turn, was anxious to have explained to him. Who built the temple at the end of the Laurel Walk? The Laurel Walk. Who built the temple at the end of the Laurel Walk? Who was the old man whose picture hung on the staircase, sitting at a table with a skull under his hand? These and many similar points were cleared up by the resources of Mrs. Bunch's powerful intellect. There were others, however, of which the explanations furnished were less satisfactory. One November evening, Stephen was sitting by the fire in the housekeeper's room reflecting on his surroundings. "Is Mr. Abney a good man, and will he go to heaven?" he suddenly asked, with the peculiar confidence which children possess in the ability of their elders to settle these questions, the decision of which is believed to be reserved for other tribunals. "Good! Whew. Bless the child," said Mrs. Bunch. "Mr. Abney is as kind a soul as I've ever seen. Didn't I ever tell you of the little boy he took out of the street, as you may say, this 7 years back? And the little girl, 2 years after I first came here?" "No. Do tell me all about them, Mrs. Bunch. Now. This minute." "Well," said Mrs. Bunch, "the little girl I don't seem to recollect so much about. I know Mr. Abney brought her back with him from his walk one day, and gave orders to Mrs. Ellis, who was housekeeper then, that she should be taken every care with. And the poor child had no one belonging to her. She told me so herself. And here she lived with us, a matter of 3 weeks, it might be. And then, one morning, she was out of her bed before any of us had opened an eye, and neither track nor trace of her have I set eyes on since. Mr. Abney was wonderfully put about, and had all the ponds dragged. But it's my belief she was had away by the Romani, for there was singing around the house for as much as an hour the night she went, and Parks, he declares he heard them a-calling in the woods all that afternoon. Dear, dear, an odd child she was, so silent in her ways and all, but I was wonderfully taken with her." "And what about the little boy?" said Stephen. "Oh, that poor boy," sighed Mrs. Bunch. "Giovanni, he called himself. And he came a-playing his hurdy-gurdy round and about the drive one winter day, and Mr. Abney had him in that minute, and asked all about where he came from, and how old he was, and how he made his way, and where were his relatives, and all as kind as heart could wish. But it went the same way with him. He was off one fine morning just the same as the girl. Why he went was our question for as much as a year after, for he never took his hurdy-gurdy. And there it lays on the shelf." The remainder of the evening was spent by Stephen in miscellaneous cross-examination of Mrs. Bunch and in efforts to extract a tune from the hurdy-gurdy. That night, he had a curious dream. At the end of the passage at the top of the house, in which his bedroom was situated, there was an old, disused bathroom. It was kept locked, but the upper half of the door was glazed, and since the muslin curtains which used to hang there had long been gone, you could look in and see the lead-lined bath affixed to the wall of the right hand, on the right hand, with its head towards the window. On the night of which I'm speaking, Stephen Elliott found himself, as he thought, looking through the glazed door. The moon was shining through the window, and he was gazing at a figure which lay in the bath. His description of what he saw reminds me of what I once beheld myself in the famous vaults of St. Michan's Church in Dublin, which possessed the horrid property of preserving corpses from decay for centuries. A figure inexpressibly thin and pathetic, of a dusty leaden color, enveloped in a shroud-like garment, the thin lips crooked into a faint and dreadful smile, the hands pressed tightly over the region of the heart. As he looked upon it, a distant, almost inaudible moan seemed to issue from its lips, and the arms began to stir. The terror of the sight forced Stephen backwards, and he awoke to the fact that he was indeed standing on the cold boarded floor of the passage in the full light of the moon. With a courage which I do not think can be common among boys of his age, he went to the door of the bathroom to ascertain if the figure of his dream were really there. It was not, and he went back to bed. Mrs. Bunch was much impressed the next morning by his story, and went so far as to replace the muslin curtain over the glazed door of the bathroom. Mr. Abney, moreover, to whom he confided his experiences at breakfast, was greatly interested, and made notes of the matter in what he called his book. The spring equinox was approaching, as Mr. Abney frequently reminded his cousin, adding that this had always been considered by the ancients to be a critical time for the young, that Stephen would do well to take care of himself and shut his bedroom window at night, and that Censorinus had some valuable remarks on the subject. Two incidents that occurred about this time made an impression upon Stephen's mind. The first was after an unusually uneasy and oppressed night that he had passed, though he could not recall any particular dream that he had had. The following evening, Mrs. Bunch was occupying herself in mending his nightgown. "Gracious me, Master Stephen," she broke forth, rather irritably. "How do you manage to tear your nightdress to flinders this way? Look here, sir, what trouble do you give to poor servants that have to darn and mend after you?" There was indeed a most destructive and apparently wanton series of slits or scorings in the garment, which would undoubtedly require a skillful needle to make good. They were confined to the left side of the chest, long, parallel slits, about 6 inches in length, some of them not quite piercing the texture of the linen. Stephen could only express his entire ignorance of their origin. He was sure that they were not there the night before. "But," he said, "Mrs. Bunch, they're just the same as the scratches on the outside of my bedroom door. And I'm sure I never had anything to do with making them." Mrs. Bunch gazed at him, open-mouthed, then snatched up a candle, departed hastily from the room and was heard making her way upstairs. In a few minutes, she came down. "Well," she said, "Master Stephen, it's a funny thing to me how them marks and scratches can come there. They're too high up for any cat or dog to have made them, much less a rat. For all the world, as my uncle in the tea trade used to tell us of when we were girls together." No, sorry, I skipped something here. Let me go back a little bit. Apologies. "Well," she said, "Master Stephen, it's a funny thing to me how those marks and scratches can be there. They're too high up for any cat or dog to have made them, much less a rat. I wouldn't say nothing to Master if I was you, Master Stephen, and just turn the key of your door when you go to bed." "I always do, Mrs. Bunch, as soon as I've had my prayers." "Ah, that's a good child. Always say your prayers. Then no one can hurt you." Herewith, Mrs. Bunch addressed herself to mending the injured nightgown, with intervals of meditation until bedtime. This was on a Friday night in March, 1812. On the following evening, the usual duet of Stephen and Mrs. Bunch was augmented by the sudden arrival of Mr. Parks, the butler, who, as a rule, kept himself rather to himself in the pantry. He did not see that Stephen was there. He was, moreover, flustered, and less slow of speech than was his wont. "Master may get up his own wine if he likes, of an evening," was his first remark. "Either I do it in the daytime or not at all, Mrs. Bunch. I don't know what it may be. Very likely it's the rats, or the wind got into the cellars, but I'm not as young as I was, and I can't go through with it as I've done." "Well, Mr. Parks, you know it's a surprising place for the rats, the hall." "I'm not denying that, Mrs. Bunch. And to be sure, many a time I've heard the tale from the men in the shipyards about the rat that could speak. I never laid no confidence in that before, but tonight, if I demeaned myself to lay my ear to the door of the further bin, I could pretty much have heard what they were saying." "Oh, there, Mr. Parks, I have no patience with your fancies. Rats talking in the wine cellar, indeed." "Well, Mrs. Bunch, I have no wish to argue with you. All I say is, if you choose to go to the far bin and lay your ear to the door, you may prove my words this minute." "What nonsense you do talk, Mr. Parks. Not fit for children to listen to. Why, you'll be frightening Master Stephen there out of his wits." "What? Master Stephen," said Parks, awakening to the consciousness of the boy's presence. "Huh. Well, Master Stephen knows well enough when I'm playing a joke with you, Mrs. Bunch." In fact, Stephen knew much too well to suppose that Mr. Parks had in the first instance intended a joke. He was interested, not altogether pleasantly, in the situation, but all his questions were unsuccessful in inducing the butler to give any more detailed account of his experiences in the wine cellar. We have now arrived at March 24th, 1812. It was a day of curious experiences for Stephen, a windy, noisy day which filled the house and the gardens with a restless impression. As Stephen stood by the fence of the grounds and looked out into the park, he felt as if an endless procession of unseen people were sweeping past him on the wind, borne on restlessly and aimlessly, vainly striving to stop themselves, to catch at something that might arrest their flight and bring them once again into contact with the living world of which they had formed a part. After luncheon that day, Mr. Abney said, "Stephen, my boy, do you think you could manage to come to me tonight as late as 11 o'clock in my study? I shall be busy until that time, and I wish to show you something connected with your future life, which it is most important that you should know. You're not to mention this now to Mrs. Bunch or to anyone else in the house, and you better go to your room at the usual time." Here was a new excitement added to life. Stephen eagerly grasped at the opportunity of sitting up till 11 o'clock. He looked in at the library door on his way upstairs that evening. He saw an old silver gilt cup stood on the table, filled with red wine, and some written sheets of paper lay near it. Mr. Abney was sprinkling some incense from a round silver box as Stephen passed, but did not seem to notice his step. The wind had fallen, and there was a still and full moon. About 10 o'clock, Stephen was standing at the open window of his bedroom, looking out over the country. Still as the night was, the mysterious population of the distant moonlit woods was not yet lulled to rest. From time to time, strange cries, as of lost and despairing wanderers, sounded from across the mere. They might be the notes of owls or water birds, yet they did not quite resemble either sound. Were they not coming nearer? Now they sounded from the nearer side of the water, and in a few moments they seemed to be floating about among the shrubberies. Then they ceased. But just as Stephen was thinking of shutting the window and resuming his reading of Robinson Crusoe, he caught sight of two figures standing on the graveled terrace that ran along the garden side of the hall. The figures of a boy and a girl, as it seemed. They stood side by side, looking up at the windows. Something in the form of the girl recalled irresistibly his dream of the figure in the bath. The boy inspired him with more acute fear. Whilst the girl stood still, half smiling, with her hands clasped over her heart, the boy, a thin shape with black hair and ragged clothing, raised his arms in the air with an appearance of menace and of unappeasable hunger and longing. The moon shone upon his almost transparent hands, and Stephen saw that the nails were fearfully long and that the light shone through them. As he stood with his arms thus raised, he disclosed a terrifying spectacle. On the left side of his chest, there opened a black and gaping rent, and there fell upon Stephen's brain, rather than upon his ear, the impression of one of those hungry and desolate cries that he had heard resounding over the woods of Aswarby all that evening. In another moment, this dreadful pair had moved swiftly and noiselessly over the dry grass, and he saw them no more. Inexpressibly frightened as he was, he determined to take his candle and go down to Mr. Abney's study, for the hour appointed for their meeting was near at hand. The study or library opened out of the front hall on one side, and Stephen, urged on by his terrors, did not take long in getting there. To effect an entrance was not so easy. The door was not locked, he felt sure, for the key was on the outside of it as usual. His repeated knocks produced no answer. Mr. Abney was engaged. He was speaking. What? Why did he try to cry out? And why was the cry choked in his throat? Had he too seen the mysterious children? But now, everything was quiet, and the door yielded to Stephen's terrified and frantic pushing. On the table in Mr. Abney's study, certain papers were found which explained the situation to Stephen Elliott when he was of an age to understand them. The most important sentences were as follows. It was a belief very strongly and generally held by the ancients, of whose wisdom in these matters I have had such experience as induces me to place confidence in their assertions, that by enacting certain processes, which to us moderns have something of a barbaric complexion, a very remarkable enlightenment of the spiritual faculties in man may be attained. That, for example, by absorbing the personalities of a certain number of his fellow creatures, an individual may gain a complete ascendancy over those orders of spiritual beings which control the elemental forces of our universe. It is recorded of Simon Magnus that he was able to fly into the air, to become invisible, or to assume any form he pleased, by the agency of the soul of a boy, whom, to use the libelous phrase employed by the author of the Clementine Recognitions, he had murdered. I find it set down, moreover, with considerable detail in the writings of Hermes, that similar happy results may be produced by the absorption of hearts of not less than 3 human beings below the age of 21 years. To the testing of the truth of this receipt, I have devoted the greater part of the last 20 years, selecting as the corpora vilia of my experiments such persons as could be conveniently removed without occasioning a sensible gap in society. The first step I effected by the removal of one Phoebe Stanley, a girl of certain extraction, on March 24th, 1792. The second by removal of a wandering lad named Giovanni Paoli on the night of March 23rd, 1805. The final victim, to employ a word repugnant in the highest degree to my feelings, must be my cousin, Stephen Elliott. His day must be this March 24th, 1812. The best means of effecting the required absorption is to remove the heart from the living subject, to reduce it to ashes, and to mingle them with about a pint of red wine, preferably port. The remains of the first 2 subjects, at least, it will be well to conceal. A disused bathroom or wine cellar will be found convenient for such a purpose. Some annoyance may be experienced from the psychic portions of the subjects, which popular language dignifies with the name of ghosts. But the man of philosophical temperament, to whom alone the experiment is appropriate, will be little prone to attach importance to the feeble efforts of these beings to wreak their vengeance on him. I contemplate with the liveliest satisfaction the enlarged and emancipated existence which the experiment, if successful, will confer on me, not only placing me beyond the reach of human justice, so called, but eliminating to a great extent the prospect of death itself. Mr. Abney was found in his chair, his head thrown back, his face stamped with an expression of rage, fright, and mortal pain. In his left side was a terrible lacerated wound, exposing the heart. There was no blood on his hands, and a long knife that lay on the table was perfectly clean. A savage wildcat might have inflicted the injuries. The window of the study was open, and it was the opinion of the coroner that Mr. Abney had met his death by the agency of some wild creature. But Stephen Eliot's study of the papers I have quoted led him to a very different conclusion. The end. Spooky. Spooky tales. That's our first story of the night. Having a look at the comments here. Shannon Jones is here as well. She says spooky things. Asbury Hall. There were a few words in this one that I had to look up. I did some searching. I was trying to figure out the pronunciations because some of these works that I've been reading are from like the 1800s, and I just didn't know how to say some of these things. I'd never run across these words before, and that's one of them. I don't know if it's Aswarby Hall, Aswarby Hall. There was another pronunciation that supposedly the people who live there use. I think I started with Aswarby and then went with Aswarby for the rest of it. I think the jury's out. If anybody knows how to pronounce Aswarby, leave it in the comments. I'd love to know. All right. Moving on. Our next tale. Dagon by H.P. Lovecraft. I'm writing this under an appreciable mental strain, since by tonight I shall be no more. Penniless, and at the end of my supply of the drug which alone makes life endurable, I can bear the torture no longer, and shall cast myself from this garret window into the squalid street below. Do not think from my slavery to morphine that I'm a weakling or a degenerate. When you've read these hastily scrawled pages, you may guess, though never fully realize, why it is that I must have forgetfulness or death. It was in one of the most open and least frequented parts of the broad Pacific that the packet of which I was supercargo fell victim to the German sea raider. The Great War was then at its very beginning, and the ocean forces of the Hun had not completely sunk to their later degradation, so that our vessel was made legitimate prize, whilst we of her crew were treated with all the fairness and consideration due us as naval prisoners. So liberal, indeed, was the discipline of our captors, that 5 days after we were taken, I managed to escape, alone, in a small boat with water and provisions, for a good length of time. When I finally found myself adrift and free, I had but little idea of my surroundings. Never a competent navigator, I could only guess vaguely by the sun and stars that I was somewhere somewhat south of the equator. Of the longitude, I knew nothing, and no island or coastline was in sight. The weather kept fair, and for uncounted days I drifted aimlessly beneath the scorching sun. waiting either for some passing ship or to be cast on the shores of some habitable land. But neither ship nor land appeared, and I began to despair in my solitude upon the heaving vastness of unbroken blue. The change happened whilst I slept. Its details I shall never know, for my slumber, though troubled and dream-infested, was continuous. When I at last awaked, it was to discover myself half sucked into a slimy expanse of hellish black mire, which extended about me in monotonous undulations as far as I could see, and in which my boat lay grounded some distance away. Though one might well imagine that my first sensation would be of wonder at so prodigious and unexpected a transformation of scenery, I was in reality more horrified than astonished. For there was in the air and in the rotting soil a sinister quality which chilled me to the very core. The region was putrid with the carcasses of decaying fish and of other less describable things which I saw protruding from the nasty mud of the unending plain. Perhaps I should not hope to convey in mere words the unutterable hideousness that can dwell in absolute silence and barren immensity. There was nothing within hearing, and nothing in sight, save a vast reach of black slime. Yet the very completeness of the stillness of that landscape oppressed me with a nauseating fear. The sun was blazing down from a sky which seemed to me almost black in its cloudless cruelty, as though reflecting the inky marsh beneath my feet. As I crawled into the stranded boat, I realized that only one theory could explain my position. Through some unprecedented volcanic upheaval, a portion of the ocean floor must have been thrown to the surface, exposing regions which, for innumerable millions of years, had lain underneath unfathomable watery depths. So great was the extent of the new land which had risen beneath me, that I could not detect the faintest noise of the surging ocean, strain my ears as I might. Nor were there any seafowl to prey upon the dead things. For several hours, I sat thinking or brooding in the boat, which lay upon its side and afforded a slight shade as the sun moved across the heavens. As the day progressed, the ground lost some of its stickiness and seemed likely to dry sufficiently for traveling purposes in a short time. That night, I slept but little, and the next day I made for myself a pack containing food and water, preparatory to an overland journey in search of the vanished sea and possible rescue. On the third morning, I found the soil dry enough to walk upon with ease. The odor of the fish was maddening, but I was too much concerned with graver things to mind so slight an evil, and set out boldly for an unknown goal. All day, I forged steadily westward, guided by a faraway hummock which rose higher than any other elevation on the rolling desert. That night, I encamped, and on the following day still traveled toward the hummock, although that object seemed scarcely nearer than when I had first espied it. By the fourth evening, I attained the base of the mound, which turned out to be much higher than it appeared from a distance, an intervening valley setting it out in sharper relief from the general surface. Too weary to ascend, I slept in the shadow of the hill. I know not why my dreams were so wild that night, but ere the waning and fantastically gibbous moon had risen far above the eastern plain, I was awake in a cold perspiration, determined to sleep no more. Such visions as I had experienced were too much for me to endure again. And in the glow of the moon, I saw how unwise I had been to travel by day. Without the glare of the parching sun, my journey would have cost me less energy. Indeed, I now felt quite able to perform the ascent which had deterred me at sunset. Picking up my pack, I started for the crest of the eminence. I've said that the unbroken monotony of the rolling plain was a source of vague horror to me, but I think my horror was greater when I gained the summit of the mound and looked down the other side to an immeasurable pit or canyon, whose black recesses the moon had not yet soared high enough to illuminate. I felt myself on the edge of the world, peering over the rim into a fathomless chaos of eternal night. Through my terror ran curious reminiscences of Paradise Lost and of Satan's hideous climb through the unfashioned realms of darkness. As the moon climbed higher in the sky, I began to see that the slopes of the valley were not quite so perpendicular as I had imagined. Ledges and outcroppings of rock afforded fairly easy footholds for a descent, whilst after a drop of a few hundred feet, the declivity became very gradual. Urged on by an impulse which I cannot definitely analyze, I scrambled with difficulty down the rocks and stood on the gentler slope beneath, gazing into the Stygian deeps where no light had yet penetrated. All at once, my attention was captured by a vast and singular object on the opposite slope, which rose steeply about 100 yards ahead of me. An object that gleamed whitely in the newly bestowed rays of the ascending moon. That it was merely a gigantic piece of stone, I soon assured myself, but I was conscious of a distinct impression that its contour and position were not altogether the work of nature. A closer scrutiny filled me with sensations I cannot express, for despite its enormous magnitude and its position in an abyss which had yawned at the bottom of the sea since the world was young, I perceived beyond a doubt that the strange object was a well-shaped monolith, whose massive bulk had known the workmanship and perhaps the worship of living and thinking creatures. Dazed and frightened, yet not without a certain thrill of the scientist's or archaeologist's delight, I examined my surroundings more closely. The moon, now near the zenith, shone weirdly and vividly above the towering steeps that hemmed in the chasm, and revealed the fact that a far-flung body of water flowed at the bottom, winding out of sight in both directions, and almost lapping my feet as I stood on the slope. Across the chasm, the wavelets washed the base of the Cyclopean monolith, on whose surface I could now trace both inscriptions and crude sculptures. The writing was in a system of hieroglyphics unknown to me, and unlike anything I'd ever seen in books, consisting for the most part of conventionalized aquatic symbols, such as fishes, eels, octopi, crustaceans, mollusks, whales, and the like. Several characters obviously represented marine things, which are unknown to the modern world, but whose decomposing forms I had observed in the ocean-risen plain. It was the pictorial carving, however, that did most to hold me spellbound. Plainly visible across the intervening water, on account of their enormous size, were an array of bas-reliefs whose subjects would have excited the envy of Dore. I think that these things were supposed to depict men, at least a certain sort of men, though the creatures were shown disporting like fishes in waters of some marine grotto, or paying homage at some monolithic shrine which appeared to be under the waves as well. Of their faces and forms, I dare not speak in detail, for the mere remembrance makes me grow faint. Grotesque, beyond the imagination of a Poe or Bulwer, they were damnably human in general outline, despite webbed hands and feet, shockingly wide and flabby lips, glassy, bulging eyes, and other features less pleasant to recall. Curiously, though, they seem to have been chiseled badly out of proportion with their scenic background, for one of the creatures was shown in the act of killing a whale, represented as but little larger than himself. I remarked, as I say, their grotesqueness and strange size, but in a moment decided that they were merely the imaginary gods of some primitive fishing or seafaring tribe, some tribe whose last descendant had perished eras before the first ancestor of the Piltdown or Neanderthal man was born. Awestruck at this unexpected glimpse into a past beyond the concept of the most daring anthropologist, I stood musing while the moon cast queer reflections on the silent channel before me. Then suddenly, I saw it. With only a slight churning to mark the rise to the surface, the thing slid into view above the dark waters. Vast, Polyphemus-like, and loathsome. It darted like a stupendous monster of nightmares to the monolith, about which it flung its gigantic scaly arms, while it bowed its hideous head and gave vent to certain measured sounds. I think I went mad then. Of my frantic ascent of the slope and cliff, and of my delirious journey back to the stranded boat, I remember little. I believe I sang a great deal, and laughed oddly when I was unable to sing. I've heard indistinct recollections of a great storm some time after I reached the boat. At any rate, I know that I heard peals of thunder and other tones which nature utters only in her wildest moods. When I came out of the shadows, I was in a San Francisco hospital, brought thither by the captain of the American ship which had picked up my boat in mid-ocean. In my delirium, I had said much, but found that my words had been given scant attention. Of any land upheaval in the Pacific, my rescuers knew nothing, nor did I deem it necessary to insist upon a thing which I knew they could not believe. Once I sought out a celebrated and sorry, let me go back here. Apologies. I once sought out a celebrated ethnologist and amused him with peculiar questions regarding the ancient Philistine legend of Dagon, the fish god. But soon perceiving that he was hopelessly conventional, I did not press my inquiries. It is at night, especially when the moon is gibbous and waning, that I see the thing. I tried morphine, but the drug has only given transient surcease and has drawn me into its clutches as a hopeless slave. So, now I am to end it all. Having written a full account for the information or the contemptuous amusement of my fellow men, often I ask myself, could it not all have been a pure phantasm? A mere freak of fever as I lay sun-stricken and raving in the open boat after my escape from the German man of war? This I ask myself. But ever does there come before me a hideously vivid vision in reply. I cannot think of the deep sea without shuddering at the nameless things that may be at this very moment crawling and floundering on its slimy bed, worshipping their ancient stone idols and carving their own detestable likenesses on submarine obelisks of water-soaked granite. I dream of a day when they may rise above the billows to drag down in their reeking talons the remnants of puny, war-exhausted mankind. Of a day when the land shall sink and the dark ocean floor shall ascend amidst universal pandemonium. The end is near. I hear a noise at the door, as of some immense, slippery body lumbering against it. Oh, it shall not find me. Oh, God. That hand. The window. To the window. The end. Dagon. Fish creature. I had some fish for dinner, as a matter of fact. It was pollock. With apologies to Dagon and all the fish creatures mentioned in this story. Sometimes I don't think before I say things. Thank you all for joining me. That's a conclusion of our tales for this evening. I'd like to thank you all again for joining me. This has been It's been a fun series to do. We got one more night coming up. I was thinking about doing a Halloween reading, but not gonna make it. Not gonna be able to happen. So Thursday is gonna be our last reading. I'm looking at the comments here. Feel free to say things. I see Atlee Gilbert is here. Hello. Why not both? Shannon says, okay, that last part, the drug-induced fever dream was creepy. I agree. That was creepy. That was weird. I guess he was trying to drown out his visions, his horrible experience. You know, that thing reminded me, that whole description of that vast dry plain where the ocean was supposed to be, and the way the guy wandered through it, reminded me of the first Planet of the Apes movie. There's just a similar kind of situation where there's a crash landing on a planet, nobody knows where they are, and there's this long journey across this vast desert kind of a land. And I would imagine, I've never been stranded in a vast desert, but I mean, I just might go mad myself. Going on for days and days with the sun, not knowing where you are. Scary. Atlee says, fish creatures are the scariest of them all. I'd have to agree. Fish creatures. Fish creature justice, says Daryl. Justice was had. Fish creatures got their revenge. This guy really didn't like fish creatures. Well, I think that'll do it. Just checking Instagram Live here. And I would invite you all to come back one more time this Thursday, 8 p.m. Central, right here. I'll be with you. We're going to do one last reading for the Halloween season. I hope everybody is having a good fall. And watch some spooky movies. Thanks again. I will see you all next time. Goodbye.